Hey guys, welcome.
Thanks.
Back again.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Thanks.
I just came back to the country about a week ago, so still lacking on sleep. Yeah, so everyone's here for Mithril. Right? It's called the best little framework you never heard of.
Oh, I thought it's called Mithril.
I don't know what it's called. It's that word up there.
So they pronounce the movies, Mithril.
Yeah, why not? Yeah. It's a form of currency in some fantasy RPGs and games and things, so there's that too. Yeah, I call it best little framework you've never heard of simply because I haven't met very many people at all who've heard of it or don't even know what it does and do all that. And once I found it, I was like, what the heck is this? Dug into it a little bit more and I was like, okay, this is pretty simple. I like this. I'm going to use this. And I did. So after about 6 or 7 months, here I am talking about this. So this is my experience, I guess, in the last 6 or 7 months. This is mostly going to be an introductory talk. I kind of want to cover 80% of sort of what Mithril has to offer. Because at 20%, you can look at it on your own time. That's if you're digging deep into it and you really want to find all the little nitty-gritty details, and I don't want to cover that. So that's me. I'm Jonathan Curran. I consult, I do development, I teach, I coach teams, individuals, software development in general. I enjoy doing all 3 things. So far, I think I've actually found that I like teaching better than anything else. It just kind of forces me, puts me out there and have to learn everything, have to know a lot about everything. I enjoy that. Yeah, and I do speak from time to time. The 2 things that have been kind of motivating me in the last 3-4 years has been sort of a drive for me personally to focus more on software that is simple. And I mean simple as in not trivial. I mean simple as in compositionally put together software. Because if you put pieces of software together in take small little apps or small little components and compose them, it's much easier to understand that than just to write everything in a big monolithic sort of layer. On that front, I've been kind of moving more towards the functional languages. One part of the project that I'm working on currently is actually written all in Haskell. It's actually really nice after a big giant learning curve that's just exponential. But the payoff has been excellent. I've done stuff in F#, OCaml, which are sort of related. F# is a nice little language to look into. Basically, I kind of use the functional aspect because I like immutability and I kind of like the guarantees that the type systems give me when I develop code. This obviously is lacking in JavaScript, but that's sort of another day. All right, what is Mithril? Mithril is simply put a client-side MVC framework. It is lightweight, it is tiny. Personally, I don't care about that. It's just nice and easy to use with, that's why I use it. It's robust, and I say robust because it includes everything you need for a spa. It has routing, has requests built in, and it's got composition via components. We'll take a look at that in a bit. Those 2 things together, you don't really need much more than that. Well, much more as in the tiny piece that's missing if you want some sort of data persistence syncing everywhere. That, I think Ember is quite a good little component for that. And there's some other tools and libraries out there that do that. But yeah, we'll take a look at that. And then I just think it plays well with others, as in it doesn't get in the way of any other libraries, it doesn't exclude you from using anything else. So you can use it alongside everything else, and that's not a problem at all. It doesn't require you to buy into its entire way of thinking, which I kind of like as well. You use it as a library, a little bit less so than a framework, but it is, at the end of the day, a framework. And it's fast. It does DOM diffing. If you all have looked into sort of React and how it kind of does things, or just take a look at, there's a project out there that just a pure DOM layer that does diffs. I can't remember the name of the project. But yeah, it basically builds up a tree and compares that with what's in the browser already. It just replaces the change pieces. So it doesn't redraw the entire page. Just kind of nice. Yeah, so that's that. This is some performance numbers I got off the Mithril page. It loads pretty fast, and it is really fast in rendering. And that's with uncompiled templates. This is comparing it to a few of the other frameworks. I don't really care about this because it just doesn't matter. What I like is that it's easy to work with. Performance, not really interested in because I'm not rendering something a billion times in fractions of a I was, then I would care. All right. So this is the agenda. I just want to cover common use cases. Start from hello world, and we'll kind of move down. Components, events, compose components, and we'll cover requests, and we'll go to routing. And we'll kind of cover what I think is MVC along the way. I think lots of people have different interpretations of MVC. A lot of frameworks have different interpretations of MVC. So I just want to present what I think is the Mithril way of kind of doing things, and we'll see how we go. If you have questions, feel free to pause me, and we'll cover them step by step. So that's the goal of tonight. I just want you to say that is simple, because it's not a complicated framework. It is fairly simple to use. So that being said, I think everyone can see this. All right, so this is my presentation format. The left-hand side is going to be some HTML. On the right-hand side is going to be some code. So whatever is thrown up here actually gets rendered here. And I'm using ES6 syntax, or ES2015, or 6, ES6. Whatever the latest thing is that you can stuff in through Babel and get out something that runs in every browser. That's what I'm using up there. So this is just a little tiny document selector thing. It's basically the equivalent of the jQuery $, just for selecting something out of the DOM, right? We're good with that? Okay. Two things I want to cover first. Does everyone, all right, I'll give you all a second to look at it. Does everyone understand the difference between this function here and this function here? Okay, this function up here, pass it 2 parameters, and it'll return you an object, a little hash, which has full name, which is a function, which returns first name concatenated with the last name. So what it returns over here is an object. The object has a function inside of it. This is what this function person1 returns. If we want the name of it, of this function, we call this function with 2 parameters. We say .fullName, and then name1 is Jonathan Curran. This function returns an object. That's what this function does. This function up here, it uses this. It says, I'm going to take these 2 parameters and assign it to this. So this object now has 2 properties inside of it, which point to the attributes you pass into it. That is different than that. 2 separate things. Over here, we define a prototype, full name. And we say, hey, return this dot first name, concatenated with this dot last name. This prototype, are you all familiar with prototypes in JavaScript? It's sort of the equivalent, I hate saying this, but it's sort of the equivalent of saying super, my parent class. Sort of, not really, just sort of. Just, if you go with that image, we'll move on from that. And so the way you access the full name function over here is you do the same thing over here, but you stick a new in front of it. The reason you put new up there is because you want a new object to be created. Over here, when we do this, JavaScript says, okay, you're calling this function, and when you call full name, it says, what is this? There's an implicit this, as in there's an implicit scope provided, right? So over here, the scope is usually the window, the DOM window, or the global environment, if you will. And so it just pulls it from there, typically. But over here, since we have this over here, it actually pulls it from the local scope, instead of pulling it from this, or the window, rather. Over here, we've bound this to a new object over here. Right? And so this is entirely, here is a new object. Here, there's no object. There's no scope, rather. There's no parent scope. Over here, we've created a new one. We call it full name on it. And it sort of uses super/prototype resolution to figure out where full name comes from. All right. This is sort of JavaScript 102, if you will. Not 101, but just 102. This, everyone who does JavaScript should know, because you will encounter this everywhere if you're doing any kind of web development. All right. So this guy creates a new object. This guy creates, or this guy returns a new object or function inside of it. This one creates a new object which has a method on top of it. Full name's a method, if you will. All right. Putting that aside, remember this for we'll go forward and you'll see this in use. You probably won't have too many questions about it, but you will have to notice that it's there. All right. Apart from that, I just want to cover simple case. So over here, this is about the simplest Mithril application you can write. Mithril has this function called mount, which takes a DOM node and takes a component. It takes your component object, renders it into the DOM node. Takes it, stuffs it in there. So Mithril expects a function in your component that you pass it, which is just an object, which returns a Mithril specific flavor of HTML, which basically you kind of create within h1, say hello Jonathan, which is equivalent to h1, hello Jonathan. Nothing too fancy about that. How many of y'all are familiar with JSX in React? Okay. JSX is sort of taking these HTML and putting it inside your JavaScript. You can do the same thing with Mithril if you want to. Personally, I don't use it because I like functions, and I can generate functions, and I can take data and create trees of stuff. That's why I don't use JSX or the Mithril equivalent of it. Anyway, so yeah, you return h1, hello Jonathan, that creates that over there. Questions? If there are any questions, we have to resolve them now because it's just going to get more complicated. Yes?
So, when you're working with Mithril, you don't actually write HTML?
I don't write HTML, not in files. Not in the sense that you normally would.
So everything is done inside of JS file?
Inside the JS file.
Is that a good thing?
It's a thing. So the reason Mithril, again, the reason you write JavaScript inside, or HTML, quote unquote, inside of JavaScript is because remember I said that Mithril renders a tree and does DOM diffing. You're pretty much returning an object of Mithril here. Mithril constructs an HTML tree sort of thing, and then it diffs that against the DOM and says, okay, what's changed? Nothing's changed, okay, I'm not going to do anything. And when you invoke some event, Mithril is like, okay, what changed now? Right? You're going to call your view function when something changes and update your view somehow. Mithril takes that, compares it to what exists, and says, what changed? And just changes the components that changed. So that's the reason you kind of write it in Mithril, basically.
So is that different than jQuery, for example?
jQuery, what jQuery gives you is, you typically just have a DOM there inside the web page. jQuery allows you to manipulate the DOM ad hoc. Like you have to manipulate it ad hoc. In this case, you just return the entire view, the JavaScript equivalent of the DOM in Mithril. Mithril says, okay, did anything change? No? No? Okay, good, we're good. If it does so, then it goes and changes. So you won't see like flashes of things going in and out, basically. Especially if there's only tiny changes here and there. So if you look at, for instance, if you had, say, a login form, and you had jQuery, and you said, when user logs in, then they should, if it's invalid details, a new screen should appear. If you do that with jQuery, if you're not too careful, it can like swap out everything if the dimensions aren't too different. It'll be sort of a little bit of a, not flash, but you'll notice it. Basically, page changes, moves up and down, that kind of thing. It's a lot less prone to do so because your components sort of fit into some particular location. It's not to say you couldn't style it differently to make that happen, but there's a lot less chance of flashes. I think we should leave it at that.
Is this one thing I was reading about React.js when I read about it is the reason that versus Angular, right? When talking about it, I think it's Facebook's performance thing they talked about. If you just write however you update your HTML, right? Even if you recreate your whole HTML, it looks like the browser is like if you have version 1 and version 2 of it, it will quickly know what are the changes and it will only apply the changes.
Right.
So you don't have to manually go and pick and change, kind of think in that angle. The browsers don't work that way. So that's the reasoning that, at least I remember reading that, the performance of giving it to it and let the browser handling it is much faster than trying to go in and making small changes. Instead of making a small change, you just rebuild the whole and then just give it, it'll take care of it.
Right, yeah. Basically, if you want to make lots of changes all over the place in the DOM, it's less performant to do that than to just say, take the whole DOM and display it. Yeah. Yes?
If you can put HTML5 within that code, can it be affected by CSS files?
I put the HTML5, sorry, in here?
Yeah.
So you're talking about cross-site scripting, sort of, right? No.
Huh?
Mithril protects against that.
Wait, what? CSS files and cross-site scripting aren't the same thing.
Not cross-site, as in basically talking about if you put HTML inside of this tag over here. So let's say the user inputs something, right? Eventually it's going to come down to here. You're going to display that variable, whatever the user ended up entering. No, Mithril escapes that and then shoves it into the DOM.
It shows it in the DOM, but if the element is described by CSS, it'll instantly take that attribute.
Yeah, it was, I think the same.
Maybe I'm thinking of something different.
A CSS.
Yeah.
Oh, can you put a CSS class?
If you have your H1 is supposed to look like this particular font and in this color.
Right. Okay, you're talking about actual attributes, not putting the CSS inside of this thing over here or some script thing. Okay. Yeah. Yes, you can specify your HTML in here. You can put attributes. You can put links. You can put events. Everything you can do in HTML, you can do inside of here. We'll take a look at that shortly.
But I think, if I'm clarifying your question,
Yeah, I think I understood it wrong.
if this is going to update, you're going to have a new DOM whenever you do your update. And all the elements in the DOM will still adhere to any CSS descriptors that have been specified on that page.
Correct.
So that H1, when it goes in, it's not going to be the naked default
No.
H1. It's going to be H1 with whatever H1 CSS or location-based
Correct.
CSS there.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. I get jQuery. I don't know.
Yeah.
Good clarification for how
This
works.
adheres to all the rules that normally apply anyway. Nothing changes. There's no shadow DOM magic happening here, so nothing to worry about there. All right. So this one over here, we're still kind of using a v function. Right? We're not really doing MVC. Here we are going to introduce a controller. Controller, all we're going to do is set this.name to get. And up here in our view, we get past the controller. Mithril, when it looks at a view function, one of the arguments it passes to it is an instance of the controller if you've specified a controller. So here, controller ends up being an instance of this. Remember how I said we used the new function to build an object? Mithril does that over here. So we can return, or rather, Mithril will take this, instantiate an instance of the controller, and pass it into our component, or pass it into our view. That way we can access things on our controller inside the view. So here, putting an array saying hello, name, exclamation, and there we are. So simple controller view separation. We'll move on. Questions about this?
What is hash v1?
That's a selector tag for this HTML component.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, again, m.mount takes a DOM element and takes a component. The component is just an object that you create. Okay. So now we introduce MVC, right? Got our model. Basically, what we had in the controller previously, we just lifted it into a model up here. And then over here, we're going to create a new instance of our own model. So over here, if you can think about it in your controller, you can do whatever it is you need to do to create models so that it gets passed into the view over here. So the way you access the model is via controller. Controller.model, over here, .name, refers to this guy over here. And then transitively, model that's defined here translates to this guy over here. Just MVC, nothing too complicated. For trivial things, this is useless, but I just want to point out the concept of it, because we'll use that going forward. So, Mithril's sort of MVC works in this particular fashion. This entire piece over here is what you provide to Mithril. Mithril sort of kicks off the entire process by saying, okay, I got your view now, let me render it once. So once it renders it, this entire cycle gets into play over here. So when the user goes and does some sort of event, clicks a button, enters some text, something or other, typically you bind it with a Mithril specific piece of code. When Mithril notices something has happened, it calls your controller, or wherever you specified, hey, call this controller, do this action, right? Your controller then does some modifications to the model, which then updates the view. If the event is triggered, if it's complete, Mithril goes and checks on your view and says, hey, has anything changed since this event finished? No? Okay, I'm not going to do anything. Yes? Okay, I'll change and apply the diffs. In a nutshell, that's kind of how Mithril works. It's fairly straightforward. You supply it a component. It gets triggered on actions, on events that the user does. When those events finish, after it calls your functions, it just goes and compares the view and just renders it. Nothing terribly complicated. It's pretty straightforward. This is literally the life cycle of Mithril. That's it. Nothing terribly complicated. This is not UML, so don't. I had someone tell me this is incorrect UML. It's not UML. It's just from lines into boxes. Don't worry.
It's interesting you allow the model to contact the view directly.
The view uses the model, right, via the controller. I don't know if these arrows are right. I'm sorry. Because remember, inside of your view, you have access to the controller. Right? And you access the model via your controller. So that's method. So other schools of thought, there's, a view can have its own versions of models, and there's other ways of doing MVC. This is just sort of how Mithril handles MVC. I just want to make that clear. Is one way better than the other? I don't know. I don't. All right, so here's how we kind of model an event, right? I'm going to change some text here. Tab out of it, it should change there. Right, so I change some stuff and things happen. Nothing complicated. So the way this sort of works is, let's take a look at the controller first. The controller, we define some options that have nothing, right? It's just an empty object. Create a new model. Our model is simple, it's just a name attribute, pass an event. And you say, hey, I'm going to create a function over here called onNameChanged. It's going to receive an event, and when it receives this event, it's going to be a function. Then, set the model name to event target value, which is how you access the DOM for the value of something that triggers that event. In this case, the event that we will end up triggering is the onChange event. So that means when the focus is lost from the input box, the trigger will get, or the event will get triggered. In our view function up here, we're creating a div. There's an array there. If you want to nest things, you can just nest it. Create h1, hello, our model name. Over here we're saying, hey, take an input, the type is text. The value, initial value is control the model name. When it changes, call this function. Right, so when it changes, we'll call controller onNameChanged. This is here. When the event triggers, the model name is set to event target value. This is sort of how you do normal JavaScript stuff. Right? Nothing terribly fancy. This actually is a lot of boilerplate for not much work. Hopefully you can agree with that. Mithril provides some tiny little wrappers that kind of help your life make it a little easier. So this next slide over here is just that, right? Slightly less code, like 4 lines. We kind of got rid of a few things. So see over here, this model, we just have a better event, which is the name over here. And you'll see up here that I'm using this prop, m.prop. M.prop is just a property getter and setter. It's a function, when given a value, will return to you an object which has a setter and a getter. That's all that is. So the way we kind of use that property over here is we do control model name. Over here, you see that it's not an attribute, it's a function, right? Because remember I said it's a getter and a setter. So in order to get the value out, we call it as a function. It gets that value out, and then it stuffs it in the h1. The onChange event, we're saying, hey, when it changes, called, do this thing over here. With attribute is, how do you say, it's an event factory, or event handler factory. Basically, it just creates a function, gives you a function. That's all it does. It takes some values and outputs a function for you. So with attribute, Mithril says, okay, I'm going to pluck the value out of the event, and then supply it to a function over here. So remember I said property is a getter and setter. So that's the reason I'm able to pass this into it here. So when with attribute is called with value of this guy over here, Mithril returns a function that plucks the value out of the event supplied, and then calls this function with the value of it. Right, so this is equivalent to this work, this entire function down here. This entire thing right here, the value, is replaced by this function. It's just an abstraction, that's all it is. Yes?
So, when you're instantiating the model, right, when you have a component for
Yes.
the model, so you're always passing some value. So ideally, in ideal case, like you would be passing the selector's value, or
No, this is just any value you want, right? This is just a name up there. This is the name property.
that it's coming up with the value better event. So if you're, let's say, binding with the form element to the input field, so you wouldn't have any value by default.
Yeah, you can just leave it empty, or you can set it to local storage or whatever it is, wherever you want to get the data from. It's applied. Yeah, you can. It's just a regular object. The model is currently. Questions?
Does the Mithril do like the events, get listeners, are they directly on the elements, or is it like where they bubble up to they get mounted?
So they're however you want to specify, right? So in this case, we're attaching the handler directly on the element up here.
So Mithril doesn't intercept these events at all, they go directly?
No, they go directly to you. It does actually intercept them, but it just sort of keeps track of, is it done?
Do it, how's it intercepted? Can you inspect that? Is this like live?
Yeah. You don't have to tell me where to go. Here, inspect it.
Well, I mean, it doesn't get
There. Let's see. Should be dollars here, right? Where's the other? See, there's a function that Mithril kind of takes and
There it
intercepts.
is, okay.
Yeah, because it intercepts it because it needs to know when that event is finished.
Yeah.
That's basically it. So yeah, if you get into places where you're drawing thousands of items, or you have actions a user can take on 1,000 elements, you don't want it to be any too much. You want it to be one level higher. And so you do that like you normally would anyway. Mithril doesn't care. Questions? Remember, this with attribute is just an abstraction for this function over here. We're good? We're basically taking this function and just, it's a function that returns a function. It's functional. We good? Because if there's questions, we need to, going forward, we're going to use more of this.
So where is the on change? Oh.
Right there.
No, that's in the function, right? But I think in the previous one you had it in the controller.
No, it's just over here. Yeah. So over here, I'm calling the controller explicitly, basically.
Oh, now it's just.
Now Mithril is sort of handling that and saying, okay, I'll take the value out of the target and I'll stuff it into this function, which happens to be our model.
So you're now setting the model from in the view.
Yes, you have to, right? Because that's where events get bound. That's where you have to bind your events, is in the model, or in the view, sorry. There's no circumventing that in any framework, ever.
No, I mean you call the function of the controller, but don't expect the view to touch the object. Right? Usually you're kind of some level of abstraction.
It's still in the controller, right? Because this
But you
model
now the
name-
view knows about the model's name, specifically.
Yeah, it has to, because the
And
controller
it has to know at some level, yeah.
Yeah, somewhere, somebody needs to pass, or somebody needs to make that glue happen. Whether it's Mithril, whether it's your own self, whether it's another thing that's hanging over it, somebody somewhere has to make sure.
No, I think the point that I'm trying to make is who modifies it, right? I always thought the view modifying the model, right?
Right.
In this case,
It is
literally
a view, modifying the model.
Yeah,
via
but
the
not
controller.
through the controller. It's
Right.
not doing it through the controller in this case.
It's technically
No, no.
right. It's you're correct. As in the view itself does not have an instance of the model.
Yeah.
Yeah. the instance is provided by the controller.
It's like you have the pointer to it, so you're changing it. So
Exactly.
that's how it looks like right now.
Yeah.
But but my thought is usually you want to decouple that because the modification happens in the controller, not through the controller.
Yeah, but in this case, because we're kind of stuck with the DOM is view and events bound together. So we have to live with that in any HTML, unfortunately.
No, I think you live with it, but I think you have to create some layers of abstraction which helps you later on while trying to control changes. Because if you change everywhere in the view, like view is, this example is simple, but
Agreed.
if you take a very complex view,
Yeah.
now you don't know exactly where the view is going to change my model now. You still
Yeah.
have a setter, and
If
so
this
you
is
can
not
control
more-
it in the model itself
Yeah.
because you have a setter function. But
Yeah, if this was much more complicated, then I think I would agree with you. As in, hey, over here, just call the controller function.
yeah, that's
That, yeah, and then let the controller do what it needs to. In this case, we're short-circuiting, if you will, for the purposes of an example. All right, so we good with this? Just an input handler kind of thing? Great. All right, I'm going to cover sort of what Peter touched on, as in, hey, can I do CSS select? Can I put CSS in here? Can I put this in there? Can I put that in there? Yes, you can. So what Mithril does, remember I told you it kind of creates a tree of stuff? It's what it does. It creates an object. An object is nested quite deeply, depending on how big your DOM stuff is that you provide to it. So when you actually call h1 hello, this is actually what Mithril creates. It creates an object with a tag. This has no particular attributes on it. It says, hey, the children is an array. Inside of it, I'm going to put whatever was over here. Mithril creates this object. It uses this object to then do the diffs against the DOM. Something more complicated. Create a button which has an attribute data ID equals 1, and then we set a class on it, dot big, and then another class is called big button. This expands out to this over here. Class name is big, and then big button. Data ID is 1. On click is do this thing over there. Children is this text. Nothing magical. If you look at the console, play around with it, this is what the output will be. These CSS selectors are basically like HTML or CSS, actual CSS selectors. They're just shortcuts of things. If you use Jade templates in Node, for instance, this is the sort of stuff you end up doing in Jade. That's just shortcuts for building some HTML. So yeah, you can pass this tag with some text content, tag with an array, which takes either text content or more nested Mithril calls for doing rendering DOM elements, or you take a tag, which the attributes is an object, and you can provide attributes inside of it like you did up here with onClick, and in the previous slide, value, for instance, as well. So that's sort of the general description of what you can put in the DOM element created by Mithril, which is all your HTML. Remember the property I said was a getter and setter? This is just a getter down here. We just instantiate this up here, and when we call it, it's a getter. When we set it, in this case, it's a setter. So now the value is changing. Right? Nothing terribly complicated. So I said you can use parts of Mithril elements out of it. This is what we're doing over here and up there. I'm going to go find this element, DOM element. I'm going to set draggable to true. And when this onClick happens, I'm going to do this sort of the normal way of how we do things. You know, we say, hey, when it's onClicked, set it to this function, which takes an event, do event, target, get attribute. This is off the screen. You know, saying, hey, get the attribute ID. So when we click it, it should alert us the ID of this element, right? So I go up here and I click. It says, hey, the ID is element MPA. If I use Mithril, I can just say, hey, with the attribute, get the ID of the target, and then call this function. The function is just drag whatever the value is, which happens to be the ID. So if I click here and drag ID. These two functions, or the result of these two applications, are the same, as in the alert gets there with the ID there. Does that clarify sort of how the with attribute works? Yes, no? see some squinting eyes here. Why not? What's the trouble? It's okay. Like it took me, I think, maybe about 20, 30 minutes staring at the stuff and actually figuring out what with attribute does in order to figure it out. With attribute basically does event target get attribute ID and then calls your function. That's basically it. All right, just a small little shortcut provided. All right, components. How do we do components? It's pretty simple. Create a model, do some stuff in it.
So this is all Babel syntax.
This is ES6 syntax.
Yeah, okay.
This works natively in Firefox as it is on the screen.
Okay, but ES6, right?
ES6, yes. So let's create a little component. It's a spinner. It goes up and down. That's all it does. As a value, when we call increment, it should increment. When we call decrement, it should decrement. Nothing complicated with this model, what it does. The controller, we just initiate a new spinner model. And we say, hey, the default value should be 10. That's kind of what's gets rendered up there. We say, hey, okay, in the view, we'll create a spinner div that has a class called spinner on it, and it has these three elements inside of it: the button, span, and button. So button, span, which is the 10 up there, and a button. And the buttons are both bound to decrement up there and then increment. Right? Nothing particularly complicated. So when we go click, it should change the value of it. Because remember when I said the event finishes triggering, Mithril will go check the view, see if anything's changed, and then it goes and does that. So it's a pretty simple component. It's nothing too fancy. However, I would suggest, if you're going to be writing components like this, this is my sort of normal take on how I did things in the beginning, right? I'd write my own little handlers for values up there. Going forward, as I learn a little bit more and want to sort of compose different components together, I found that having a getter and setter is actually, via Mithril's property, it's actually much more useful. So I basically took this component, spinner, and changed it to use properties. Nothing complicated. Now, this is just a property that I say increment that, or decrement that, and increment that, using a getter setter syntax, if you will. Functionality provided by the Mithril's property object. And when I render it, the only thing that's changed is instead of value, now it's value as a function. I call it, it gets put up there. The initial value is end-up prompt 10. So the initial thing is just 10. So it's the same spinner, except now the properties, or now the attributes for the value is a getter and setter. The reason that's important is because of this example. In this example, I'm taking two spinners, hooking them together, their values, and computing the sum of it. I want you to kind of focus on sort of the controller first, if you will. The controller, we're just taking two default values, 2, 5, and 3. We're saying, hey, create a new model. This model is our new little adder model with some default values, right? The model up here is just takes value A, takes value B. We create two Mithril properties for value A, value B. We say, hey, this model, when the sum function is called, return the value of A plus the value of B. This component by itself is trivial. It's nothing complicated. Controller, again, pretty trivial. The really neat stuff is, now here we can say, hey, Mithril, remember that spinner 2 component we had in the previous slide? Create a component out of it, explicitly, and I want you to pass this value, controller model value A, into it. Remember over here we had default value, that was in the prop 10. So over here we're just saying, pass this value A into the value. We're doing the same thing, value B, pass it into the value there. And then after you're drawing those two components, draw this other thing down here where it's H2 sum, and I want you to call controller model.sum. Right? Nothing terribly complicated. The reason, again, this works is because the value A and value B over here are properties, they're functions, right? Over here we change this to that. So when we increment this, this becomes is now a function. That the data gets set inside the property. So when we click plus or minus, the data that actually gets changed is inside this value property over here. And we've hooked that up into the sum function up there. Right, when we're calling that, we're saying you can get the values of those two things out. So now, we change this. We're changing the value of one component, and it's reflected in our parent component. Right. It's a pretty simple way to share state, if you will. That's basically the component in Mithril. You can say, here's a component, here's some value, plug that into this component's value. You can literally create a pipe of things, and it just works. You don't have to explicitly call things, you don't have to explicitly send things, there's no bus, none of that. You just literally hook things up, and it just works. It renders things, it changes things on events. No matter. I like that. Because it just, I don't know, it feels a lot cleaner to me, personally, when I'm developing this, and I want to compose the functionality of separate components into each other. I just say, okay, here's this thing, it's shared between these three things, and I just leave it. It just works. Questions about this?
So can you explain how the component works?
Basically. Right? Mithril takes an object, which is supposed to have a view, and optionally a controller. When it has a view and a controller, or when it has either rather, it creates and instantiates and holds on to the instance of that particular component. So when we do m.component here, we specify the object. Mithril is saying, okay, render this component inside this view over here. Rather, we're calling view. And inside of it, we've got this, our little component. What Mithril does is it holds on to this instance of that component and calls its view function and renders that inside this array.
So is the component is your tag or no?
No, the component is this object, right?
Oh, that
Spinner
object,
2,
okay.
which has model, view, and controller inside.
Oh, everything. It's a spinner
Everything.
too. Okay,
Yeah.
gotcha. Yeah.
And so this adder thing is also a component, which then has two separate components inside of it. So Mithril holds onto these instances, and it remembers for you. So it doesn't create a new instance of one all the time. Right? It has an idea, okay, which referenced component is this? So it's not creating objects every time your view changes. So it kind of holds on to stuff like that.
So you can nest any number of components within any other
Yes.
component.
And that's
And
where
each component is a model view controller, or could be.
Yes, a model view controller, or just view, or just view controller. Yeah. And so I like that because you can just nest things down and have components do one individual thing over here that doesn't necessarily affect everything above it. It can, it doesn't have to. That's the thing. So you can work on them sort of independently, and then at the end just go, okay, I'm going to smash them into one. Functionality through composition. I like that.
What made you seek out Mithril?
Frustrations with existing frameworks that are out there. Too complex, overly back-end-like in the front end, which don't make sense to me. Back-end requirements are separate from front-end requirements. There's a little bit of overlap, but what I ended up finding was when Angular 1 came out, for instance, when it first came out, and I don't mean 1. Whatever, I just mean like sort of 1.0. I saw what I felt was a lot of back-end work being done on the front end. And that just didn't sit well with me. It's just like this is over-architected. I'm sure it's changed. Angular 2, I don't know. I would have to look at it. Just over-engineered. Simply, I can put. When you're teaching new people who come on your team, especially when they don't have back-end experience doing front-end work, it's hard to get them in the mindset of, hey, this is how you should be doing things. Because they don't have a reference model for them for the back-end to do front-end work. When you're driving a team and trying to say, hey, you're all the front-end developers, it's time for you to learn this thing, it's hard to do that. Front-end, for the longest time, has not had sort of rigid sort of engineering, like software architecture sort of applied to it for the longest time. Slowly, I think that's happening. For the longest time, that's just been happening.
Yeah, you need dependency injection. Spinner 2, I don't know about it. By the time when I'm building adder,
Yeah,
how do I get my dependency injection?
again, yeah, so, you know, a lot of patterns and things emerge in the back end where it's useful, right? There's a reason for that to exist there. In the front end, you can just kind of willy-nilly do things. And people have willy-nilly done things forever, right? And so when you say, okay, now we need to use patterns in the front end, we're like, okay, I don't get this.
I don't know, with ECMA 6 out, I mean, you're trying to do the events and all that. Again, it basically looks like backend to me. I mean, it almost looks like C# or Java in terms of programming language itself. The JavaScript that we know before is
The
not the
language
same
is
anymore.
not that big a deal. It's
No, I mean the
language.
patterns, right? When you start writing your code,
Right.
I think most likely if you were coming from C# background, you will end up writing like that, right?
You'll try to, and you'll fail miserably. So people have tried to take the concept of object-oriented into JavaScript literally, and they just can't wrap their minds around it because it's not a Noah language. But people try and shoehorn their previous experiences into the current thing. So the state where I was in when I was searching on Mithril and other libraries, honestly, I looked at Vue.js earlier, and I prefer that because that's just it's a cleaner version of Angular, to be honest. Where was I going with that? I don't know. It's not particularly important.
No, I think the key thing I was bringing it up is I think the syntax of the front-end language, right,
Right.
is trying to map to the object-oriented language, which might confuse people, like you said.
I think that's still a minor thing.
Now we are having modules, classes,
Yeah.
so you tell me. I mean, it's
Bringing
no
the
more prototype.
rigidity, if you will, of the back-end experience to the front end.
Yeah, you're getting type safety, maybe you're more strict.
Try to, yeah.
And when you say back, you mean the C# later,
I mean
layer.
server-side
Java,
languages, yeah.
server-side code.
Yeah, like my experience has mostly been in the JVM world. I've done a bit of .NET as well. But yeah, they don't map one-to-one. They just don't.
Because it's a single thread.
Yeah, single thread and there's callbacks, right? In the back end, at least for the longest time, you have callbacks, but they weren't explicitly used unless you were doing GUI programming. In JVM land, that for me personally, that meant I was doing everything server-side in Java. I don't experience callbacks because I don't use callbacks in Java explicitly. They're not there. They're hidden from me. If I was doing .NET stuff, sort of familiar with delegates, but it's not explicit that this is going to call, and now I have to subscribe to this, now I have to do this manually. It's all syntax sugar, which I appreciate the compiler doing it for me. I don't need to do that. Anyway, I think I'm
Okay,
getting
cool.
sidetracked.
I mean,
Thank you.
that's a good thing.
Yeah.
But you tried a bunch of different.
I tried lots of
Okay.
things. I actually tried Ember. I was like, okay, this is too much for me. Maybe it's changed now. I don't know. I tried, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 different languages. Not language, frameworks, libraries, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Is this closer to like React?
This is very close to React, but simpler in my opinion because it just comes with everything. You don't need to go take this off the shelf and that off the shelf, and take Flux and all this other stuff just to make it work. Mithril comes with everything in a box. You just go do it.
I think you have the next one. You're going to talk about routing, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay.
I kind of wanted to touch on this, but I'm going to skip it. Sorry. Here's a tiny little component, right? It's just a ticker. When I start it, it should update every n number of milliseconds or seconds, right? That's basically kind of what I've kind of modeled this on. And the default number of ticks is, where did it go? Right, it's off the screen, that's why I can't see it, sorry. There it is. So this ticker, all it does, like I said, it should update the value over here every 200 milliseconds. Right? Up here, this is just boilerplate, if you will. If you want to get into it, you can right now, but just for the purpose of the example, just ignore it. What I want to demonstrate to you is that we're changing the value of what's going to be up here inside this update ticker, which is called in an interim. It's done sort of outside of an event system. Because there's no event when you call set interval, clear interval, right? It's not, or even a set timeout, for instance. There's no on-click event, there's no on-change, there's no DOM event associated to a timer event in JavaScript. So that's what I want to convey to you here. So when I click start, it should start counting up, right? It started, it's not showing anything. When I click stop, oh, it's 2,300 milliseconds have passed. Any reason as to why? Anyone think of that? I just mentioned it too. All right, there's no DOM event. Mithril doesn't know about it. Mithril does not know, okay, something happened. Right? If you need to plug in Mithril to other things, this next slide shows you how. You literally just call Mithril readable whenever you want your events to, whenever you want Mithril to go kind of check in on your views, if you will. So now if I click start, it'll start ticking. Because inside the interval, when I go change the ticks, now I'm saying, hey, Mithril, go redraw. Now Mithril kind of knows, okay, I need to go do something. Because it's not, remember, it's not a DOM event that's fired. Because only DOM events Mithril kind of knows about. And again, only through the view that you give it. Right, so for instance, if you're using a jQuery plugin like Selector 2 or something, and Selector has its own sort of set of events, or a calendar, for instance, like that. When you select something, and let's say you change something in the Mithril model somewhere, you need to tell Mithril to go update itself. Right? You need to do that by doing Mithril redraw. That's it. Third-party integration is as simple as that. That's basically it. It's nothing more. Which again I like because there's no hoops for me to jump through. Prefer that. Clear on that?
Are you overriding ticks, or did you create that variable?
I am overwriting.
Okay, it's not protected in Mithril as a...
No.
Okay.
All right. Thing I was going to do with the observer thing was the same thing. Like, if you have the observer, if you have an observer mixed in, observer pattern, if you will, distributing set of notifications, if you will. Especially if they reach into other third-party objects, or vice versa, rather, from the object to set of Mithril components, if you will. If you change something, Mithril's not going to know about it, right? So typically the only thing you have to do then is just say, hey, after I go notify everyone, just go redraw, that's it. So if you're doing stuff like that, just keep that in mind. All right, on to requests. This is how you define requests in Mithril. Requests in Mithrils are, they return promises, or something very, very, very close to what a promise is in JavaScript. So the nice thing is you can compose those promises together, you can do error handling in really neat fashions. I'm not going to get into that. Promises are a set of features on their own that I would encourage you to go outside and kind of learn or ask me about afterwards. Basically, you just kind of say, hey, over here, rather, I'm creating this HTBin function object, if you will. I'm just setting some attribute. Then I'm setting the creating get method on it and saying, hey, when this function gets called, call and return the value of m.request. M.request, you pass it an object, and it's sort of similar to how you do jQuery. It's nothing, it's fairly similar. You say methods get URL, here's the URL, here's some data I want to pass to it, and over here you notice the type over there. Type's an interesting little construct in Mithril. If you provide the attribute type and you provide a function, Mithril will instantiate this function and pass it the data. So what that means is you don't have to do all the data massaging inside of here. You can do it inside your own function somewhere else, and Mithril will just kind of instantiate types for you. Right. So, simple definition, we're going to reach out to htbm.org, do a get on that, and we'll get some data. So create this lazy IP component. All it does is when on get is clicked, which is this button over here, it's going to go call htbm get. And remember I said it's a promise, so I use the then function and say, hey, when it's done, return a successful value in this model, and return it to this function. And if there's a failure, return it to this function here, this other. So when I click get, it gets my external IP. Right, that's pretty simple. You just say, hey, create the function request, go do it. When you're done, call a function, which is, remember over here, this is a property, right? And so it's going to do a set into that, it's going to be a new HTTP bin type because over here we said create this type HTTP bin, right? Up here you notice that the HTTP bin over here is empty. When I refresh the page, you'll see that it's an empty value because there's no value in the first one, right? When I click that though, when the request comes back, Mithril over here gets whatever the data that the server gave us and stuffs it into this function over here, which it creates a new instance of. And so we're just doing this external IP equals data origin. In this case, it gets our external IP address. Yes?
Does Mithril allow you to do inline functions on those storage? And if so, thank you for not doing it that way.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of preference up to you, right? Like how you structure your code. Typically, I have a model, and inside my model, my models are nowadays mostly smart models, because I want them to encapsulate all the business logic. And so, yeah, this is how I write code.
Okay.
So,
And then chaining. So I missed the promise. It's how robust is the chaining? Do you?
You can do multiple chains here, so you can have then do this, and then you can have another set of thens as well. So on success, it'll call the first function. On failure, it'll call the second function. It'll do the same for the rest of your.
You could keep then.
It'll just propagate forward.
Okay.
Promises are neat. There's other libraries that kind of do really neat things inside of them. I'm not much into that right now. But yeah, Mithril takes this notion of functions and just interleaves it everywhere sort of inside its code. So you can write small little pieces of code like that and just have it work instead of writing your own function handler manually and then doing whatever it is you need to do there.
How does, so, and I can only compare this to jQuery. jQuery's chaining creates, you're chaining on an object, and so each object in the DOM gets its own queue. And when you start chaining, you're chaining on top of that DOM's queue. So if you hop to a different DOM, you create a parallel thread, you can end up in a race condition. How does, with Mithril's DOM diffing, how does chaining work?
There shouldn't be any data races because it's all single threaded. So
Is what?
it's single threaded, JavaScript in general. So you shouldn't have any data issues.
Well, so jQuery creates two different things that start executing in parallel, operation, not finish all these operations and then do these.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Okay, yeah.
It's single threads
So
wrong
yeah,
way.
if you created two, let's say we did this twice, they should be getting twice. They would follow their own set of operations. As to how that gets completed, which order they get completed, is unspecified.
Okay.
So about that, I'm actually very glad that you asked that question because remember how I said Mithril only changes things after events have completed, right? When we do this HTTP bin get, because we use Mithril's request thing in there, Mithril emits its own event.
Okay.
Therefore, it knows, okay, this event finished, something happened, I should go redraw. So even if the completion order was unspecified, at the end of it all, it would know I've finished, and it would go redraw everything.
Okay, so yeah, I guess I thought I understood from earlier that even though stuff's going on in the background, that doesn't qualify as a DOM event that
Correct.
that Mithril listens to, except this is a DOM event, or this,
When it finishes, it's a DOM.
how do you know which functions are DOM events?
So whenever you use, yep. So whenever you have event handlers inside your view like this on click,
Mm-hmm.
that is a DOM. That will fire Mithril's sort of event, if you will, and then it'll finish, redraw, and sort of request.
But the async call isn't a DOM.
The async call isn't the DOM, correct. Mithril sort of tags on something at the end of it, so it knows that you're done.
Okay.
The request is done.
I kind of understood the other way. I thought when you draw the view for the first time, right? So the events are also already figured it out and it actually split the whole DOM. So the events are already there, that's why it is triggering it. But when you really want to change your view, right? If you really want to change what has been constructed as HTML, or the DOM, that's when you need to do a redraw. Because in this case, when you said http.get, you could have translated that into the view. It has already got that, right?
No, because it's not synchronous, right?
No, but that function is already there. What I'm saying is some of the things are not there, but some it has it. Like for example, the H3, the button and all that when you're doing the MEMM, right? So you get the div, all the div tags, it builds the whole.
It builds the tree. Right.
It builds the tree,
Yeah.
but it also builds the events, right, with it?
Yeah, it puts the events inside of it. So I think there's a little bit of confusion here. So right now you see that it's empty, right? When I click get, nothing changes immediately. But when it finishes is when it goes update, redraws itself. Right, so there's two different things going on here. One is the on-click event triggers and it's done. Immediately it's done because it's kicked off this async thing in the background. But when it's finished, Mithril is like, oh, I know that it finished, so it goes and redraws your view. Is that?
So in this case, it definitely is again picking the view, right? Again, it
Yes,
redraws.
again it redraws the view.
But I'm saying the previous event is not like that, right? The on-click on the view, when you do an on-click on the view, does it do a redraw on the view too?
Yeah, it does.
Oh yeah,
It does.
has
It
to,
does it
right?
twice in
has
this
to.
case.
Yeah.
Right, one is when I click on it, it's like, okay, I need to do something. Did it change? And then it does other stuff.
Okay.
All right, I call this lazy IP because when I trigger some event, it happens.
But the big difference between jQuery and this is jQuery works on the live DOM, right, directly.
Yes.
Most likely, until unless you really specify that this is the string of thing that I want to really build. It's always running the function. When you're changing it, it's really changing the DOM directly.
It really changes the DOM as each little thing happens.
Yeah,
This
either-
thing doesn't do that.
Yeah.
This thing does it at the
That's the
end
big
of all the
difference.
changes. So you'll never see all the changes happening live, basically.
Yeah, that's like when with chaining, if each function does not trigger a DOM event, then you're chaining objects and you're chaining stuff in
Right.
memory, but you have to tell it when to update.
Right.
So in that case, you're saying that this wouldn't cause havoc with something like D3?
It shouldn't, no. This is only when everything finishes, that's when
Right.
it'll go say, okay, and go do something. But I don't know how D3 handles its stuff, but that might be a conversation afterwards.
D3 is I think it's the functions, right? You want to call.
Right,
That's
but in
a
that
different
case,
library
well,
company.
but in that case, it's doing it on the live DOM as opposed to this happens.
Here's the cool thing. Mithril has you remember how I said the viewer here returns DOM? SVG is included, so you can create SVG elements in here and bind things to Mithril events. And so, if I click this SVG element, then Mithril will say, okay, go do something. When it finishes, it can redraw your SVG. So if you need to do stuff like that, you can.
Yeah, SVG also redraws everything because that's the only way you can paint that particular area. It's not like you're working on a tags, right? Because the way that whole object is built.
Right.
I think the whole idea is, I think the more you change the text before you apply to the DOM, I think you get a lot more performance at the end of the day.
Things don't change live, basically.
Yeah, if you
Until
keep
it's
trying to
set
change
up.
live, like that's the backend biggest caveat, right? If you think like the backend, that's what you do a big mistake. If you start looking at your DOM like, oh, I'm changing it, then you basically are going to run very slow.
This is closer, Mithril React, or closer to the interpretation of the backend sort of rendering than, say, jQuery.
Yeah.
Basically.
I think it's cool. I mean, it seems to be simple to understand.
Yeah. All right, let's take a look at this other thing. All right, I'm going to create a new little function called delay. I'm going to give it a number, and it's going to call HTML delay plus that number. I'll pass it some data, type. Here's a couple of interesting little things. I give it an initial value, where I'm saying, hey, set the orders into fetching, and background is true. These two things do one thing combined. When delay gets called, because in our controller here, we immediately call it. We call it over here when the controller gets instantiated, right? So you'll notice when the page loads, it says fetching up there. And then it'll slowly change to something else, right? When this controller gets instantiated by Mithril, immediately what initial value does is it says, okay, I'm going to set the initial value to whatever this delay thing returns, so my request, I'm going to give it an initial value and hold on to a reference to that initial value. And background just says, should I run async? Because by default, things don't run async in Mithril because the event system basically. It needs to pop stuff off at the end when request complete. So in this case, you're giving initial value and saying, hey, go do it in the background. So when the actual request finishes, because Mithril has a reference to the initial value, it then goes and swaps it out when your promise is resolved. Then you have to kind of call redraw yourself. Does that make sense? You get an initial value, it stuffs it on the screen immediately, but when that promise resolves, that's when you need to call redraw basically. Because again, this is now explicitly not in the event system because it's backgrounded and you've already provided the value. Right, so if you need to display loading data, a bunch of different loading sections, this is how you do that.
So what happens in this case if you don't do it in the background?
It'll sit there with nothing displayed. That's the bad thing. So you need to do something like this. And this is the only time you would do it is when you're loading things. Show a spinner icon, for instance, something like that. It comes with a nice little Mithril. It comes with a tiny little thing called sync, which takes 2 requests or any number of requests, and only at the end of it does it then go resolve everything. So in this case, I'm doing, delay of 1 second, about or so, and then 4. So I'm expecting that one of these requests is resolved before the other one. But when both of them are finished, then it should set the message to all of them, and then it'll redraw. That's what I want to happen. So when I refresh the page, fetching, one finishes, the other finishes, then it does all of them. So just simple little helper. You're doing lots of requests, you're calling multiple endpoints, you're waiting for all that data to come in to know that all the data is loaded, then you do something. That's sort of the pattern used. It's dirt simple. So I like that. It's nice. It makes writing code a lot easier. So you don't have to spawn different things and wait on different things and do different things. So it's nice.
The delay function takes in seconds, not milliseconds.
Takes seconds, yeah. And that's just a service called HTTP bin that I'm using. It's a nice little target test sort of service. It has all the REST functions and a bunch of different things. Just kind of play around with it. When you're using demos and example scripts, for instance, you're just trying to proof of concept kind of thing. It's useful for that. Are you good with that?
So it looks like if you update the model, it kicks in redraw. Or you can
Where do you update that model? It depends on that.
Or where do you update the model?
Where and who does the updating, right? Because if the updating is triggered by a DOM event that Mithril knows about, then Mithril will redraw. Otherwise, it won't. Which is why over here at the end we have to redraw ourselves. Okay. All right. So that covers requests. Right? We're up to requests. I didn't cover post and delete and all that stuff because you can look it up in like 5 seconds. That's just an example over here. Just unsecure. I'm going to show you the last part is going to be all of our things. So far, we've created lots of these different components, right? In this page, I'm stuffing them up all. Actually, let me pick up full screen so you can see. Notice the URL up there. All right, so this is a hello component. Or rather, it's also the default thing. Just want you to notice the URLs now and the components as well. Hello component 2, 3. Works, right? 4. Little spinner. Spinner 2, same thing. Our adder works. Ticker, or broken ticker rather, works. And then ticker 2, which actually, I stuffed all those into this. Actually, there's more, I'm sure. Yeah, there's all the other examples I put on there. What I want to convey here is the routing. The routing, again, hooked up to components as well. So let's just take a look at the code because it's just a lot easier to look at. All right, is that readable? I'm just going to skip straight down because all I've done here in the beginning is just list all the components that I had in these previous examples. Nothing fancy. All right, if you will, please direct your attention over here. This is sort of how you set up routing in Mithril. You say, hey, I want to route on this DOM element. It doesn't have to be document body, it can be another element. That's where Mithril is going to render all of it itself into. And you're saying, okay, the default route should be /application, and then I'm going to pass it a list of routes. The routes are just an object with URLs and components to the right-hand side. You can pass parameters to URLs via colon, some tagging, and Mithril will then pass that into your component as well. Or rather, it won't pass it in. You have access to that component keyword, URL parameter, if you will, when you want to do route-based stuff. So our application over here is just this component right here. Before that, let's just take a look over here. I've built a list of components, or an object rather. I've given them names, and on the right-hand side are just the actual components themselves, right? Of all the stuff that we previously defined up here in our previous examples. So this is just a key value pair mapping of names to components. And that gives them components over there. Our application, then, is simply a controller, which takes, which shows the current component based on the route parameter that's up there. So when you call m.route.param, remember I said down here you can have access to the URL parts if you've declared a colon some word up there. So we're just getting that parameter. Whatever the value is, we're going to go look it up into this component, which will set to this.component. If there is no m.route.param specified, we default to hello component. That's pretty clear, right? So there's a default hello component. Otherwise, go get whatever else one of these is. And then console log, that's basically it, right? So our controller, when it gets instantiated, it just pulls something from the URL and says, okay, it's going to be this component now. So when that happens, we're just going to return a view, which has, over here, a list of the components, which maps to their names, basically. And we do /app plus the component name. So that /app/component is basically that bar up there, this entire thing, little toolbar, is what we're rendering with this nav part. So we're just taking the list of components that we have and stuffing them into A tags. That's all this part is right here. So this is the neat part over here. We're saying create a main div and create a component out of whatever the component is inside the controller. Which, if you remember, we just kind of go to the parameter component, pull it from this list, from this key value parameter. Yep.
When you're creating, so is the selector the same if that's ID equals main?
Yes.
And so is that available, once that's created, is that available in the DOM that you could use another library to go out and find it?
Yes. So we'll take a look. Here, right? Take a look at the inspector. We've got body, we've got div, and yeah, we've got main over here.
Okay.
And the nav is where all our links kind of get rendered, basically. Our ticker gets rendered over here. So,
Thank you.
yeah. So you can link to other things, events, all that stuff. When the route changes, for instance, we're drawing a new component. Just kind of give you an idea how you can map components to routes. It's really simple. It's literally that word right there, but then you have to parameterize over whatever's in your route. Basically, that's really it. That's routing in Mithril. It's like 2 lines code. Yes.
Where you have line 280.
Yep.
Can you have multiple instances of that? So you have two separate components that change routing only once.
Hey, you can only have one, simply because there's only one URL. So when that changes, both of those then would have to change. You might as well just have one. And just abstract over it, basically. Other questions? Yeah.
Can you have any other like so you have to have some kind of query string or number of parameters in your route?
Yeah, you can have multiple parameters. I've only showed one route parameter, but you can have multiple. And I believe you can have more. I want to say. Yeah, you can do sort of a splat like that. So it'll capture anything between the right-hand side and the left-hand side. You do dot, 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 that kind of thing. So you can capture that. And then when you do route parameter date, for instance, over here, it pulls in everything that was in between it. So you can have multiple of those stacked as well. Or this is sort of the var args version, if you will. You can do that too, if you like. Yeah, and you can have multiple route parameters. So I use that not for sorting, but for some other thing, which is pretty similar, to toggle sort of the state of what gets rendered. I've got like a login form, for instance, and then there's one piece that when the user is new, it should display this one particular thing. And the only way I know that is if I go contact the server, and the server tells me it's new. So then I just toggle the flag up there, it gets passed down to whichever component is interested in it, and it renders the correct thing. So I don't build it into the component itself, the component gets the data from somewhere else. One of the really nice things about Mithril I personally appreciate is the level of effort they put into their documentation. I can't say that for a whole lot of new libraries that are out there, but it's very thorough, and there are a whole bunch of examples. And if you're confused by any particular topic, there is a Gitter. Channel, like sort of like chat online. Like Gitter is basically like a chat channel for GitHub projects. So the developer and other people are always on there. So if you have questions, just literally hop on there, and they're happy to talk about it. And you can see the project status and all that jazz. Ask questions. Mailing list, I haven't really used it. I use it once, I think, to figure out how to integrate it with sort of Bootstrap. And I had to wrap my mind around how Mithril works first, because I was like, well, I have Twitter Bootstrap, and it has jQuery components. How do I use that in Mithril? Well, you can do that if you want to, but the proper way of doing it is actually just grab the markup Bootstrap has, stuff it in Mithril, and you're done. I was like, okay, that's pretty simple. nothing to do about that. And all the events that the JavaScript pieces in Bootstrap have are all just are all events you can trigger yourself. And so that makes integration with any framework really easy. So you can call all that stuff, and all the styles get applied properly. It's pretty easy. Yeah, documentation is a big part of why I choose libraries. And I found this library to have excellent documentation. Everything is documented fairly well. The learning part of it here, the author's written a bunch of blog posts starting from basically 2014, I think is when he wrote all of them. And so he compares and contrasts things at that time to what was there. All those sort of lessons, if you will, still apply today. So just because it's old doesn't mean it's bad. So
Is it still interactive at all?
yeah, it still is. They're working on the next version, but I don't know when that's going to be released. So I've been very happy with it so far. My project has done pretty well. Just because everything is, again, componentized. I only have to worry about components in one particular area. When I compose them is when I can do the integration testing. Otherwise, everything can be tested independently on its own, which is kind of nice.
It's got to be a pretty good community of people.
Yeah, people are pretty helpful. There's a lot of stuff built up on top of it too. So if you look at the community page, I think, or where's the wiki? Yeah, there's a GitHub wiki on there, and there's a bunch of stuff that's on there. I definitely recommend having a look. There's other third-party components and things like that people have already done, so you can just grab them, use them if you need to. Yeah, pretty much anything you need is on there. You should definitely kind of look at the solutions to common problems thing, which is here, I guess. So, talk about authentication, how to do that. That's one of the interesting things when you're building a spa is like authentication. It's like, okay, well, how do you handle this properly? The proper way to do it is handle it in your model. And then barf if there's something wrong, or redirect or do something. But yeah, when your page loads, you typically kick off some auth mechanism. When it comes back is when then you can conditionally load certain things in Mithril. Because it is synchronous, that first part is when you make that request before any of the view gets rendered. So then you can kind of conditionally set up routes and things. So for instance, if you've logged, I go to this page, it's a spa, it's a Mithril, any spa, make a request, it says you're not authorized. When that request finishes, in that completion function, I can just go check whatever header that's your current, and then do route and build all the non-logged in sort of components. You can do that. You can load that dynamically if you want to via AMD or require JavaScript. However you want to load those components, you can. They don't all have to be in the same file. It's just JavaScript at the end of the day. There's no hard set requirements as to how it needs to be laid out, how it needs to interoperate. It's just regular JavaScript. You can load stuff on the fly if you want. You don't have to do that. I don't. I end up using rollup, which you write ES6 modules. It combines things, and then it tosses all the stuff, the code that you didn't use, which is useful. It's useful when you're sharing a lot of components between separate concerns. Because typically you'll have some overlap, but you don't use the same common code in both places. So tools like rollup inspect that. They see whether code is calling this other code. If it's not, then it just throws it out. Useful. That was really it for me. Short talk. Hopefully that kind of gave you a glimpse of sort of the 80% high-level view of Mithril, what it has, what it can give you. Yeah, any questions? Further stuff, experience, questions related?
I guess, what's the adoption rate been like?
Interesting I mentioned that, because it is not high. Right? It's not as high as Angular. You're not going to find someone who throws Angular on their resume. It's not as popular. But I find that because it's not as popular, people who have heard it, people who have used it, have a better understanding of Mattermost. That's been my personal thing. Right? Like the colleagues I've expressed this to, I said, hey, have a look at it. They come back and they're like, that is really good. We should use that. It forces that kind of thinking. It's not for, it's the same thing as if you go to if you're working with colleagues, and it's sad to say, some of them aren't as motivated as the other ones. That's just a natural part of human life, I guess. Nothing you can do about that, right? But you notice that the people who take interest in certain things, they react certain ways, they think differently. They think about problems in this particular way, and sometimes you can relate to that. And this, I find, lets me relate to people in just that level of thinking. So it's not a bad thing in my experience, it's perfectly fine. Like I mentioned, one part of my project in Haskell is a tiny component, but the tiny part of it, I've been encouraged to write it. And I like that, I have that kind of encouragement. Haskell is by no means a popular language at all. It really isn't. But the people who understand the benefits of it are like, okay, we should do it that. If that offers that, then we should go ahead.